All right. Hello, I'm Kristen Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, joining you for another online presentation for horticulture and gardening. If you're here live, appreciate you being here. Welcome to the program. If you are watching on YouTube, the recording of this presentation, thank you for watching. And if you have any questions, if you're watching on YouTube, I do invite you down in the comments section. Please feel free to ask any question you would like to about this or any other horticulture related topic. And I will be very happy to respond to you either privately if you provide your contact information or just right there in the comments section. I'd also invite you to subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already. That'll allow you to get notifications for when I put up new videos. So today I am going to be talking about ornamental grasses. Ornamental grasses have a lot of advantages in the home landscape. They can provide a lot of interest and a lot of color. So I'm going to start off talking just a little bit about what we're talking about what the grasses are, and then we're going to talk about how we can use them in the landscape and manage them, and give some examples of some of the ornamental grasses that you might be interested in adding to your landscape. So to start off, we are talking about grasses. Those are monocots, and I would invite you to go back and look at the presentation that was on plant diversity. Because there's a lot of information that you can pick up about what I mean when I say a monocot. But really, when we're talking about grasses properly, we're talking about members of the families, the Gramineaceae and the Poaceae, and there is quite a lot of diversity in the plants within those groups, because those families are quite large, about 10,000 different species. And these are some, of course, the Gramineaceae and the Poaceae are very important, not only as ornamental plants, but also, of course, for row crops and things like that. Now, when we talk about ornamental grasses, we have cool season grasses and warm season grasses. They develop at different times. We have woody grasses, and really only going to talk about one group of those. And herbaceous grasses, and then we have annuals and perennials. So, within just the group ornamental grasses, there's a lot of different groups that we can talk about and different ways those plants can be used in the home landscape. So to kind of give an idea what a cool season grass is, most of the plants we grow down here in the southeastern United States are going to be warm season grasses, but for cool season grasses, as the temperatures start to warm up, photosynthesis actually shuts down. So they don't grow actively during the warm season of the year. And because of that, they tend to be more adapted to northern areas of the United States. They grow well in the cooler time of the year when temperatures are down, 60 to 75, which, as you can imagine down here in Mississippi, that really, I think, we're in the middle of December. I think it might be between 60 and 75 today. So normally these are going to start growing in late winter, continue on from there, grow in really early spring. And as temperature rises, the growth just slows down, or they may actually go dormant as we get into the summer or die out completely. So not a lot of plants that we grow, but there are a few. Tufted hairgrass and feather reed grass and blue fescue all fall into that group, the cool season grasses. In contrast, we have the warm season grasses. I'm going to spend a fair bit of time later going over some of the examples of that. They continue to grow as we have photosynthesis in the summer. Temperatures, for 75 degrees and higher, even higher than 90 degrees. They do tend to break dormancy later in the spring, and they'll go dormant in the winter. Kind of just the exact opposite of what you see in the cool season grasses. And like I said earlier, most of the ornamental grasses we grow here in Mississippi, or if you're in Louisiana watching or Alabama, it's going to be the same for those states. Most of what we are going to grow are going to be those warm season grasses. Now, not all of the things that we call ornamental grasses are actually grasses. They're in other groups that are very similar. They're still monocots, but they may not be in those groups. So the taxonomists would get on to you for calling them grasses. Functionally, for me, it looks like a grass. It behaves like a grass. So we're going to treat them just as if they were in those groups, because how we use them in the landscape and how we treat them in terms of managing them is really very similar. So as long as no taxonomists get on to me, I think we'll be okay. Now, a lot of times these plants are evergreens. They don't die down in the winter or the summer, which is advantageous. And you'd certainly recognize some example of these. Liriope, which in a group called the lily turfs. Liriope is certainly one of the more common ornamental grasses, ornamental grass-like plants that we grow, or Mondograss, in addition to the sedges and rushes, other plants that kind of, again, have the same behavior as grasses, but wouldn't technically be considered grasses. So, there are a lot of advantages to ornamental grasses. There's a lot of ways that we can use in the landscape. One great thing about them, there's all sorts of different interesting foliage they can have. Certainly, all sorts of different colors, dark blues and greens, getting into fall colors with oranges and reds that you can see just in their foliage color. You also have a lot of examples of ornamental grasses where you have variegation in leaf color. You can see that there in that middle picture, where you have the lighter colored outside of the leaf, and the dark green. Often you see that the other way, where there's kind of a cream stripe down the center. You can also see the flower heads, or what we think of as the seed heads on those grasses. Can last for a really long time as an ornamental feature in the landscape, just really showy and pretty. And there's more variation than you might expect in the colors that you can see out of those seed heads. In addition, you also get here in Mississippi, sometimes we're a little starved for getting that fall color. So we can certainly see that fall color in some of the ornamental grasses. One of the things I really like about them, particularly as we talk about the taller ornamental grasses, is you get a little bit of movement out of them. So as the wind blows, you can see those ornamental grasses moving back and forth and swaying in the wind. And that can just be a really pleasant feature in the landscape as well. So I'm just going to give some examples, certainly by no means exhaustive, but just the range of use you can get out of these grasses. They work fantastically well as accent plants. Of course, we're normally thinking about trees or shrubs and things like that, but these grasses do work very well as an accent plant. With their interesting seed heads, or just the tall stalks coming up, can be very attractive just off by themselves. Really common use for ornamental grasses is in foundation plantings, right along the sides of houses or along the sides of decks or other structures in the landscape. Work very well as borders. Because they're easy to maintain. You can keep them down as you need to, and you can keep them well within the area that you want them to serve, either as a foundation plant or as a border. Speaking of borders, you can use them as perennial borders. They work fantastically well, essentially as a hedge They last a long time. They're relatively easy to maintain. And with the right selection of grasses, you can get the height out of them that really allows them to work as a border. Now, on occasion, you will need to trim them down. Just to kind of renew them. So you will need to cut that border down every now and again. But I do think they work very well as a border plant in the landscape, and particularly the taller growing varieties or species. Similarly, you can use them in container plantings. They work perfectly well. There are some grasses that I think are better used as container plants, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But they work fantastically well as an accent on a patio or a porch or right outside. And some of that is just the features of the grass look great. One great thing about some of the grasses is that they're pretty tolerant of heat or of drought, things like that. So sometimes they just don't take quite as much management as some of the other plants that we might have to deal with. So that can make them serve really well as a container planting. And of course, classically, ground covers work really well. A lot of the ornamental grasses will grow in shade, at least to some extent, and work well underneath trees or work well as a means to kind of fill in amongst other plantings. So they work really well as ground covers, which also leads into their use as an erosion control mechanism. So if you have a really sloped area, water tends to run through it. Putting these ornamental grasses there does a really good job of stabilizing soil and looking attractive while it does it. They have grasses like monocots tend to have those fairly fibrous root systems that expand outwards that really help sort of stabilize that soil. There are some running varieties that will spread and can be used very effectively to keep that runoff from being a problem on a slope. Watering for ornamental grasses, not a whole lot different than watering for other plants in your landscapes. And it's important to note that how you're going to water individual ornamental grasses can vary by the species. Some are going to favor more water than others. And of course, if you have a very sandy soil, you're likely to need to water more frequently than if you have a heavy clay soil, just as the water infiltrates past that sandy soil a lot faster. When it's really hot outside, again, you are going to need to water more. In the majority of cases, we're really looking, much like a lot of our landscape, right about an inch of water a week is perfectly sufficient for a lot of the ornamental grasses. So that's going to be very much in common with many of the other plants in your landscape, certainly in common with your lawn. So easy to integrate in terms of their water needs. Some of them are quite drought tolerant, so they don't need a lot of supplemental water. But particularly in that first year, it's a good idea, just as they're establishing, to make sure that you do give them a little bit of water and keep an eye on them for any signs of drought stress, because they need to take that first year to really establish that root system and integrate in so that they can get all the water that they need. Fertilization. Of course, just like any other plant in the landscape, I do recommend soil testing as the best way to know what fertilizer should be applied for a particular plant. Of course, we do that through the Extension Service. Other state extension services do very much the same thing, where you bring a sample into the county office and we mail that up to the state lab and they send you your results. That'll tell you precisely how and when you should fertilize the individual plants in your landscape. In the case of ornamental grasses, just kind of as a general rule, they don't need an awful lot of fertilizer. And you particularly want to avoid excess nitrogen when you are giving fertilizer to these ornamental grasses. As a result of excess nitrogen, the plant can try to just grow really tall, and it gets tall before it can really handle that. And as a result of that, you can wind up with some weak stems. Just they've gotten longer than they can hold themselves up. And as a result of that, you can get what we call lodging, or the plant simply falls over, which kind of ruins their appearance. There's some other issues that you can get with a little bit more susceptibility to disease for ornamental grasses. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about I'm not really going to spend any time talking about insects or diseases for ornamental grasses. So that might be a topic we can talk about at a later time. So generally speaking, about a half to 1 pound of 10-10-10 fertilizer per about 100 square feet is sufficient for maintaining these ornamental grasses. And generally, you're going to want to apply that just as their growth for warm season grasses starts off in the spring. Of course, for cool season grasses, that's going to be as their growth starts off very early in the spring, or potentially in the fall. Now, one of the things that I consider an advantage of grasses, I may have mentioned this already, is that sometimes you get problems on a plant. You might want to cut it back, but with a lot of plants, cutting it back can be fairly involved, or you might have questions or doubts about how you should do that. With ornamental grasses, because they are grasses, they can be cut, and they should be cut back down almost to the ground. You can cut them back just a few inches above ground level, and they will come right back, just like the grass that you have in your lawn. Monocots, like grasses, have these intercalary meristems that are little growth sections of the plant that are on the stem that allow them to elongate from that stem. So, as we get into the late winter, what I normally refer to as kind of about February, or before that growth starts, we can cut them back, and those evergreen grasses are just going to spring back. Now, there are some that are going to take longer to come back than others. So if you have an evergreen grass, you may not need to cut it back every year, but you can just kind of move your hand through that foliage, remove any old leaves, any dead parts of the plant, to kind of thin it out and allow that to refresh. But cutting back those plants is really an important part of being able to propagate the ornamental grasses in our landscape. And while certainly it's possible to produce some of these from seed, that's pretty uncommon, and there's some issues that surround that. So vegetative propagation by division is really the most common way we are going to propagate these ornamental grasses. So that might be by rhizome or by stolon, and generally you want to do this right before the start of the growing season, again in that late winter, really early spring time period, or fall for cool season grasses. And one thing, I'll talk a little bit about division here in a second, but certainly, after you divide plants, one option for you, of course, is plant them in different areas of the landscape. But if you just have small sections and you want to make sure they establish, putting those in containers is going to give them a really easy start that you can then transplant out into other areas of the landscape. So for dividing ornamental grasses, the process is relatively straightforward, and you do want to divide them about every 3 to 4 years. If we don't divide them, they can kind of start thinning out or dying out in the center. You can see a picture of that in the top image there. We don't want to have that sort of crown appearance. We want to make sure that the entire plant area is growing actively. So you want to just very simply, you're going to dig that plant up, and of course, I have an iris there as a as an example, but you dig the entire clump out of the ground. You can use a sharp tool to separate that clump, and while if it's a small plant, you can generally get away with just your garden tool or a hori knife or something like that. Though you may have noticed in one of the previous images that someone was using an axe to separate these clumps. So as they get quite large, there's a lot of root material there. It can take a little bit of effort to separate those clumps, but just use a good sharp tool. Make sure it's a clean tool when you're doing that. Separate all of the living areas of that clump out. Throw away the dead plant tissue, and you want to get those divisions back into the ground just as soon as you possibly can. You don't want the roots to dry out. So ideally you want to replant those divisions just as soon as you have gotten them all sort of cleaned up. Bamboo is a little bit different, and bamboo is the one woody plant that I'm going to really spend any time on. Bamboo is propagated by rhizomes, and living down here, I have had quite a number of experiences with people who have spreading varieties or running varieties of bamboo, and a great deal of regret because of that. So I highly recommend that you only use a clumping bamboo in the landscape. It does a little bit more difficult to propagate. They do have a shorter rhizome, but all you need to do is just separate that rhizome into sections with several nodes. Try not to bend it or try to keep it undamaged, and then you can just plant those rhizomes. The culms that come off of those initial rhizomes as you spread it may be a little bit smaller, a little bit weaker than the parent plant that you took them off of, but they'll get stronger over time as the plant grows. If you are going to use a spreading variety of bamboo, it is incredibly important that you use a way that you have a way to enclose that bamboo and keep those rhizomes from spreading out. They can be quite a nuisance, not only to you, but they have a tendency to grow under fences and give a little bit of a challenge to your neighbor. So either concrete or steel ground barriers is a really good idea. Make sure that they go down significantly deeper than the rhizome does as a way to prevent that bamboo from getting out of hand. So I'm going to get into the part of the talk where I just get to talk about some different ornamental grasses that you may run into, or maybe options for you in the home landscape. And I've got the scientific name up there at the top of most of these slides, I'm pretty sure. I'm not going to go into that too much, just to save my pronunciation muscles for the presentation. But sometimes people call things different, gives things different common names. So I've included that there just for your reference if you go back and take a look, so we make sure we're talking about the right thing. So Indian grass, it's really tall, kind of upright native grass. Has a really nice gold flower plumes in the late summer. Develops a really nice golden tan color in the fall. Grows fantastically well in full sun, is really tolerant, like a lot of our native plants, it's tolerant of different soil conditions, and it will reseed itself. So if you plant it, those seeds will be able to drop and reseed and produce the plant in the next year. And there are a lot of different varieties that are available for this. Those two, I believe I shamelessly stole from the South Carolina Extension Service, but some really interesting varieties out there, and some variation in the color of the plant. So a little bit of a kind of a blue-green color that's really interesting in the landscape. Now, muley grass is probably one of the two most popular ornamental grasses. Um, I can see why. I think it's just a really interesting, has just a beautiful plume as its flower. It is a native grass to North America. You get really fantastic pink or white flowers really late in the summer into October. And then they stay on the plant and they kind of fade to a tan through the winter. That gives a little bit of seasonal interest to them. Really, really nice foliage that you can develop, gets up to about 2 or 3 foot tall, grows fantastically in full sun, and it tolerates drought. So like a lot of the ornamental grasses, it is very drought tolerant, and just really kind of a no-nonsense plant, easy plant to manage in the landscape. Does fantastic in group plantings, just as a kind of impressive wall of color at the right time of year. And the second most common and popular ornamental grass is pampas grass. It is native to South America, but one of the things that's really great about this is the height that it can put on. It can be 10 foot tall, fantastic large flowers on them, really interesting color you can get on them. Now, interesting thing about pampas grass is that the male and the female plant, they're separate. They're male plants and female plants. So we always vegetatively propagate pampas grass because the males just don't look very interesting, aren't very attractive in the landscape. So the ones we have, the ones that look really good are the female plants. They have those large flower stalks on them. Grow fantastic in the full sun, blooming in the early fall. And they're really popular here, sort of in coastal environments. They're really tolerant of salt. They're tolerant of drought. And really importantly, for a lot of areas, deer don't tend to attack them very much. So they're sort of a deer-resistant plant. I always make sure I say that a deer-resistant plant is very much like a water-resistant watch. It's not waterproof. So if you have enough deer and they're hungry enough, there's no plant that's really deer-proof. But this one's a really good option if you have an area or landscape that the deer are just driving you crazy. This is Japanese forest grass. It is a shade-loving grass, so something that works really well, again, under trees, or works well as a plant that's going to be in an area of your landscape that isn't going to get a lot of sun. It is a perennial, so it's going to be there for years. Really nice, dense mound of leaf blades. It does really well in that partial shade. Gets up to a height of about 1 to 1.5 feet, and it's just a really good option for an area of the landscape that may get a little bit more shade than some other areas. This is Japanese sweet flag, and in terms of, if you looked at it, it does look very similar to Mondograss, which is probably a lot more commonly what you would run into. But I, really wanted to include this one because it's a plant that thrives very well in wet soil. It's a herbaceous perennial. It's going to come back every year. Will grow in ordinary garden soil if it's in partial shade. If you have an area that's got full sun, it really will need more moisture. Tolerates heavy clay soils. So it works really well as a kind of a ground cover type plant in an area that just gets a lot of water. They do flower, but the flower is not particularly distinctive. It's just a little white finger-like flower that they put on in early spring. But again, as a plant that thrives in wet conditions, it is a good option for some areas in the landscape. Much more a favorite, flax lily. Herbaceous perennial has really nice, wide, linear foliage. One of the things I really like about it, I like the flowers and the berries that it puts on. Has the small blue flowers that bloom in the spring into the summer. And then following that, it has some really nice kind of turquoise colored berries in the fall. So, as an option, just produces a lot of features in the landscape over time. Works well in shade. Really good plant for dry areas or areas where you might get a little bit of salt. So flax lily or dianella is a really good option. I really like the variegated versions of it just because I think it just adds even more features that you can enjoy for a really long time in the landscape. All right, fountain grass. Native to Africa and Asia and to the United States, the Pennistemen genus. Really nice bottle brush shaped plumes on them, all sorts of different sizes. There's a lot of variation in the color of the leaves. Really likes full sun areas. Does need a good well-drained soil. It's not going to tolerate wet conditions very well. And you do want to pay attention, some types of fountain grass, depending on where you are, because it does reseed fairly aggressively. You're going to want to make sure that you're not in an area where it can be a little invasive. There is an Oriental version, or there's a species called Oriental fountain grass that's about 4 foot tall, puts on white blooms. I think that's actually the picture up there at the top. A variety that I thought was particularly interesting was Modri. Has really nice black flower spikes. Not a color you're going to see a lot of. That shows up in the late summer and early fall. Gets about 2 to 3 feet tall. And it does have a tendency to reseed, but like a lot of times when you have a plant that reseeds, you're not really getting the same variety, so you may see some variation in those plants. This is Andropogon, or big blue stem. It's native to the Midwest here in the United States. Really adapted to a range of different soil types. Does really well in areas with low fertility. Really nice tall grass. Really interesting color. For some reason, people will call it turkey foot grass. They say that the seed head on it looks like a turkey foot. I admit to not having done the most dealing with turkeys, but I suppose imagination can get away from anyone. But it does form a nice, tall, really interesting colored, really good clump in the landscape. It gets up to a good height to serve as an accent plant or work with other plants you may have there. This is little blue stem. Has really nice, good upright appearance. Good variation in the foliage from green and blue to purple, which I think just looks really great. A lot of the varieties as we get into the fall are going to turn a really nice reddish color or a bronze color that I think provides a lot of really good seasonal interest. You don't get a showy seed head out of them, but the foliage works really well. Again, works very well if you have an area that just doesn't have really great soil. This is a good grass to put in there. You generally want to avoid fertilizing it because as we mentioned earlier, with excess fertilization, you can get the plant lodging or falling over. Just put it in an area with full sun, and I think it works really well. Now, getting into a plant that really is outside of the proper grasses, this is common rush, and there are a number of different kinds of rush, and so I'm not going to speak about each of them, but a really interesting group of plants. Seed heads kind of have an interesting look to them, but they are kind of small. They aren't particularly showy. As to manage this, just as as the blades start to brown, you can just cut them out. As you might imagine, a rush grows fantastically well in wet conditions. So if you have a water feature or something like that in your landscape, rushes just do fantastic alongside that. Um, there is a variety of rush that I thought was particularly interesting, and I think works really well as a container plant. Just has a kind of interesting look to it. That's the spiralis, or Juncus effusus spiralis. And you can see a picture of that here in the middle. You can kind of see where it gets that name because it has kind of that helical shape or spiral shape to the growth of the blades. That I think just provides a feature that you're not going to see out of a lot of other things in the landscape. So just a really interesting feature to that plant. Sedges, another group that is not a true grass, and normally when I say sedges to people, they start to look at me funny because there's of course there's some weeds that we call sedges, but this is the Carex group. Again, not true grasses, but there are about 1,500 species that are in this group. Fantastic amount of variation. And one of the few cool season grasses that we talk about. So growing very, very early in the spring or starting to grow into the late fall, work really well in shaded areas. A lot of interesting variation in the foliage for these grasses, so they can provide you some really interesting options. And of course, liriope, also not a true grass, but probably one of the more popular grass-like plants that we grow in the landscape. A very good, reliable ground cover. Has some really interesting, pretty flowers. Just need to cut it back in the spring. Occasionally we do run into issues where the tips of the liriope plant will start to turn brown, and the cure for that is really just to cut it back and let it regrow, remove all of that old foliage, and that really handles that problem. But liriope is a really great plant just because it handles shade, it handles heat, handles drought, will tolerate being out in the sun. So just a really reliable plant that works very well, especially as a border plant, lining walkways and things like that. Now, there is a clumping type of liriope. In fact, that actually is supposed to say just clumping liriope. Big Blue is one particular variety of that. Really, probably what we normally think of when we think of a liriope plant. It's a clumping habit, really nice lavender flower spikes come up throughout the clump of the plant, and you do need to add in quite a few plants just to fill in the area that you're using these in. There are varieties of liriope that have a creeping habit, so they'll grow along the ground, and they, unlike the clumping variety, have white flower spikes. But you have to watch. In a shaded area, it can be okay. Anytime you have one of these spreading grasses, you do want to be conscious that it just doesn't get away from you. But particularly if it's in the full sun, it can grow very quickly. If you have a shaded area, if you have an area that needs erosion control, it can work fantastically well. All right, Mondograss, just a really easy grass to work with. And yes, liriope is often called monkey grass, amongst other things. Mondograss is a really good ground cover or foundation plant. Really nice dark green clumps, though there are some varieties that have some other colors. So, like the black variety shown there in that image, likes partial to full sun. And not something I see all the time when I'm looking for Mondograss, but they do have some really interesting kind of lilac colored flowers in the summer. One of the great virtues of Mondograss, what makes it a really good ground cover, really good plant for the landscape, is just how low maintenance is and easy to maintain. So just a very well behaved plant to use in the landscape. All right, back to bamboo just very briefly. As I did mention when we were talking about propagation, there are two kinds of bamboo, broadly speaking, that include the spreading bamboos and the clumping bamboos. With the clumping bamboo, the stalks are going to originate from one area, then kind of fan out as they grow upward. Spreading bamboo, those stalks are just going to be spread across the ground. And spreaders do kind of have a tendency to become invasive, to grow out of the area that we want to keep them in. So, anytime I talk to somebody about planting bamboo, I always try to make sure that they're putting in the clumping varieties, just because those spreading varieties can get out of hand and be a long-term issue. They do work very well as container plants in a large container, but anytime I would be using a spreading bamboo, I would make absolutely certain I have a way of containing that in the landscape to prevent it from just taking over. All right, last one I'm going to mention, this is Miscanthus, also called Maiden grass. I got a lot of questions about it. It is native to Asia, and the reason, the thing that can be an issue about it is that it is considered invasive in some regions of the United States. There have been some cultivars that are developed that are sterile, that, because they're sterile, we don't have to worry about them quite as much for spreading and getting out of hand. But also an interesting grass because it was considered as a biofuel plant or as a biomass generating plant. But it has a tendency to get out of hand, so that is something you want to be concerned with if you're thinking about planting that. All right, so that was my conversation on native grasses. A little shorter than some of my presentations, but I hope you enjoyed it. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, I would encourage you to put a question down in the comment area. If you have one, I'll be happy to get in touch with you. And otherwise, I'll be really happy to answer questions here in the chat. So thank you very much.